There comes a day when even the kindest soul breaks, not because they wanted to, but because they had nothing left to give. For years they carried the weight of others' pain like it was their purpose. They became the quiet listener, the healer, the one who always said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Every word of comfort they gave was a small piece of themselves torn away, offered to a world that never asked if they had anything left. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And for the empath, that truth is unbearable, because to accept oneself means to face not only the light, but the darkness within. This story isn't about a villain, it's about an empath, a person who felt everything too deeply, who loved without measure, who mistook suffering for meaning. They believed their role was to absorb pain, to keep others whole, even if it meant breaking themselves in the process. They became the emotional sponge of every room, soaking up guilt, fear, anger, until they could no longer tell which feelings were theirs. Every tear they dried left a scar on their soul. Every apology they made for simply existing carved another hollow into their heart. The world called them gentle, but inside a storm was forming, silent, unseen, inevitable. At first it was subtle, a lingering tiredness that no rest could fix, a growing numbness beneath all the empathy. And then one day, something cracked. It wasn't rage that broke them, it was clarity. A sudden realization that kindness without boundaries is not love, it's self-erasure. They began to see that being good had been a form of control, a way to keep them compliant, predictable, safe. Society praises compassion, but only when it serves others, never when it protects you. And so, the empath stood before the mirror and saw what they had become, a reflection of everyone else's needs, everyone else's fears, everyone else's stories, but not their own. That was the breaking point, not a moment of chaos, but of awakening, a moment when the exhaustion turned into awareness. Because when the soul gives everything away, when every boundary has been crossed and every emotion spent, the darkness it refused to face finally steps forward and says, "Now it's my turn." That's the day the empath snaps. And it's not destruction, it's transformation. It's the death of the false self, the martyr, the pleaser, the savior. And from the ashes, something fierce begins to rise, something whole. Sound fades, the ticking clock stops, heartbeat slows, replaced by a soft exhale, as if the soul itself is breathing again. The day the empath breaks is the day the self begins to live. Carl Jung believed that empathy, like light, casts a shadow. Every virtue, no matter how radiant, carries its opposite within it. And so behind the empath's compassion, there hides something unspoken, something repressed. The empath is often seen as a healer, the one who listens, understands, absorbs. But Jung would ask, why do you need to save others so badly? Because perhaps what they truly seek is to be saved themselves. Behind every savior complex there lies a desperate hunger to be loved, to be needed. And behind every healer there is always an unhealed wound. It's not malice that drives the empath to give endlessly. It's a silent attempt to mend their own brokenness through others. They become masters at reading pain because they know it intimately. They recognize suffering in others because they've carried it for so long that it feels familiar, almost sacred. But the danger lies here. In trying to heal others, the empath begins to disappear. They dissolve into the emotions around them, confusing love with sacrifice, compassion with self-erasure, and soon, empathy turns to addiction. They need to feel someone else's pain to feel alive, because their own has been buried so deep, it no longer feels real. So they say yes when their body screams no. They forgive betrayals they should never have endured. They smile while quietly bleeding inside. They become light, for everyone but themselves. Jung called this the identification with the persona, the mask we wear to survive in society. The empath's mask is kindness, endless patience, understanding. But behind the mask, their true self suffocates. Because no one, not even the most loving soul, can live forever behind a facade. The unconscious keeps the score. Every suppressed emotion, every time the empath swallowed their truth to keep the peace, it doesn't vanish. It sinks deeper and deeper into the psyche, forming the shadow. The shadow is everything you deny about yourself. The rage you've never allowed, the boundaries you've never set, the truths you've never spoken. And one day, the shadow knocks. At first, it's subtle. A sudden irritability, unexplained exhaustion, emotional numbness. But then it grows louder, until one moment it takes over. The empath can no longer maintain the illusion. When this eruption comes, the world sees it as the empath snapping. But Jung would call it something else entirely. Integration. It's not a collapse, it's a confrontation with the parts of the self long denied. The empath doesn't become cruel, they become whole. They stop rescuing others and start rescuing themselves. They no longer confuse guilt with love or silence with peace. They finally learn that compassion must include the self, or it isn't compassion at all. In Jungian psychology, the journey of individuation, of becoming whole, begins right here, when the empath faces the truth that light without shadow is blindness. True empathy, Jung would say, is not about absorbing the pain of others, but about understanding it without losing yourself in it. And once you see your own darkness clearly, you no longer fear the darkness in others. You no longer need to fix them because you've made peace with your own. That's the paradox Jung revealed. The most selfless act an empath can perform is to finally be selfish enough to heal. Because when you integrate your shadow, your empathy changes. It stops being a desperate attempt to connect. It becomes a calm knowing, a silent strength. You feel others' pain, but you no longer drown in it. You stand in it as light and shadow united. That is the birth of the true healer, not the one who saves everyone else, but the one who remembers, I am not here to suffer, I am here to awaken. When the empath finally snaps, it is not rage that awakens, it is truth. The transformation is terrifying, not because they turn dark, but because they stop pretending to be only light. For years, the empath has been the caretaker, the listener, the soft voice in the storm. They have absorbed everyone else's pain and called it purpose. They have worn their exhaustion like a badge of honor. But the soul can only bend so far before it breaks or transforms. And when that breaking point comes, something ancient inside begins to stir. They start pulling their energy back, piece by piece, from every place it was scattered, from every conversation that drained them, every person who mistook their kindness for obligation, every situation where their silence was mistaken for peace. They withdraw, they become quiet, not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet of power returning home. People around them notice the change and panic. You've changed, they say. You're not the same. But of course they're not, because for the first time they are no longer playing a role written by someone else. Jung called this sacred inversion enantiodromia, the turning of a thing into its opposite. When something is pushed to its extreme, nature itself demands balance. The empath's endless giving collapses into a profound stillness, and from that stillness, a new center is born. The extreme of self-sacrifice flips into self-preservation. The martyr becomes the sovereign. The one who lived to soothe others now learns to soothe themselves. And though the world calls it selfishness, Jung would call it individuation. It is the soul reclaiming its axis. It is the self no longer orbiting around the needs of others, but standing finally at the center of its own universe. This process is not gentle, it's not graceful, it is brutal, because everything false must burn away. The empath begins to see the truth behind their own goodness, that much of it was survival. Being kind kept them safe, being agreeable kept them loved, and now they realize that love built on self-abandonment was never love at all. Their heart grows quieter, more discerning. They no longer rush to comfort everyone's pain. They let others face their storms because they face their own. They stop apologizing for their existence, and for the first time, they begin to feel what freedom actually is. The people who once depended on their constant giving may call them cold, detached, cruel, but this is projection. It is their discomfort in the face of someone who has stopped being an emotional mirror. What they call cold is actually clarity. What they call distance is actually healing. The empath hasn't become heartless. They've simply found their spine. It's a terrifying transformation because society glorifies the gentle sufferer, but fears the awakened empath, the one who says, "No more. No, I won't carry what isn't mine. No, I will not bleed for love." Jung saw this as the moment when consciousness expands, when the unconscious, all the denied anger, the silenced truth, the repressed boundaries, finally breaks through the persona. And in that eruption, the empath is no longer fragmented. They are whole. It is not madness, it is awakening. Because to become whole, one must meet the parts of themselves they feared most, the selfishness, the anger, the desire to be free. And in embracing these so-called dark qualities, they discover that they were never dark at all, only honest. Honesty is terrifying to those who still live behind masks. And so, when the empath speaks from their newly awakened self, their words cut through illusions like a blade of light. They no longer say yes from fear. They say no from love. They no longer give to prove their worth. They give because it feels true. They no longer heal to be needed. They heal because they are whole. This is the sacred paradox Jung revealed. What appears as death, the death of the persona, the shattering of the false self, is actually the beginning of real life. The empath's snap is the sound of chains breaking. The world will say they've changed, but the truth is they've returned to the essence that existed before the pain, before the masks, before they learned to shrink their light for others. This transformation, this enantiodromia, is the soul's revolution. And though it terrifies those who have yet to awaken, for the empath, it is liberation. Because only when you stop pretending to be light, do you finally discover that you always were. But freedom always comes with a price. When the empath awakens, when they finally step out of the role of savior, guilt follows like a shadow. It whispers in the quiet moments, "You've changed. You're selfish. You're not who you used to be." And maybe that's true. Because who you used to be was built on pleasing others, not on truth. The old self was shaped by survival, by the desperate need to be seen as good, kind, and harmless. But that image was a cage, gilded with the expectations of others. It gave love conditionally. As long as you stayed small, Carl Jung wrote that the process of individuation, becoming whole, demands the destruction of the false self. When you integrate your shadow, the parts you once buried rise to the surface. It feels like death because in a way it is. It's the death of who you pretended to be. The empath's greatest pain is realizing that their kindness was often self-abandonment in disguise. They said yes to avoid rejection. I'm fine to avoid confrontation. I understand even when their souls scream for honesty. Each act of compassion was a subtle act of self-erasure, and over years, that becomes unbearable. But when the awakening begins, a new energy stirs within. It's not anger, it's truth. And truth demands confrontation, not with others, but with yourself. Jung warned that integrating the shadow is not comfortable work. It's brutal. It dismantles everything you believe made you good. It forces you to see that sometimes your empathy was control, a way to earn love, that your forgiveness was fear, a way to avoid being abandoned, that your kindness was submission, a way to feel safe. The moment you see this, the illusion collapses, and what's left is power. Inside every empath live two archetypal forces: the healer, the one who feels, nurtures, listens, absorbs, and the protector is the one who guards the boundaries, who says no, who walks away. For years, the healer ruled unchecked, giving endlessly until there was nothing left to give. But the protector was never gone, only silenced, shamed into submission. When the empath snaps, it's not rage, it's resurrection. The protector awakens and joins the healer, and the two finally become one. This union marks the beginning of true wholeness. Empathy, once a source of weakness, now becomes strength. You still feel deeply, but you no longer drown in other people's chaos. You still care, but not at the cost of your sanity. You still love, but with discernment, not desperation. You begin to understand that compassion without boundaries is self-betrayal, and self-love without compassion is cruelty. Balance, that's the real enlightenment. Not light without darkness, but the sacred coexistence of both. The inner battle transforms into inner harmony. The healer learns to rest, the protector learns to trust, and together they form a new kind of power, quiet, steady, untouchable. This is what Jung meant when he said wholeness is not about being good, but about being real. It's not about being pure light. It's about embracing your darkness and learning to hold it with grace. So when guilt whispers, "You've changed," you finally answer, "Yes, I have. I stopped living for everyone else." You realize that transformation isn't betrayal. It's liberation. The empath doesn't stop feeling. They start choosing what to feel, who to feel for, and when to withdraw. That's not selfishness, that's self-respect. And as the dust settles inside, a strange calm appears, the kind that comes only after a storm that's been brewing for years. You see yourself clearly for the first time. Not the mask, not the persona, not the performance, just you. And in that moment of recognition, the battle ends. Empathy stops being a burden. It becomes wisdom, the kind that no longer needs to prove its goodness because it understands its worth. You still feel deeply, but you no longer drown. You still care, but not at your own expense. You still love, but with strength, not submission. And in that sacred balance, you finally meet your true self, the one who was never broken, only hidden beneath the weight of who the world told you to be. The day the empath snaps isn't the day they lose themselves, it's the day they awaken. For years, they lived as sponges, absorbing every vibration, every wound, every unspoken emotion in the room. They thought their purpose was to heal others, but healing became a habit of self-erasure. And then, one day, something shifts. They stop absorbing pain and begin reflecting it, not with cruelty, but with awareness. They see suffering without carrying it. They listen without losing themselves inside the story. They no longer beg to be understood. They finally understand themselves. They no longer chase peace in others. They become peace itself. And in that moment of silence, something ancient awakens inside. The truth that empathy without self-mastery becomes martyrdom. Carl Jung's most terrifying case wasn't about insanity. It was about metamorphosis, the death of the persona and the birth of the self. Because sometimes, the most frightening transformation is the one that frees you. The empath doesn't shatter because they are weak. They shatter because they've carried too much light in a world that thrives on taking. And when they finally stop bleeding for others, when they realize their energy, their love, their presence are sacred, they rise as something new, a sovereign soul, a being who feels everything yet remains unmoved, who can walk into chaos and not lose their center, who can love deeply yet detach completely when peace is threatened. This is the true awakening, the moment empathy becomes power. Not control over others, but control over yourself. Because when you master your inner world, no outer storm can touch you. Jung wrote that wholeness requires balance, the merging of light and shadow, compassion and strength, love and truth. When the empath embodies both, they are no longer fragile. They are fierce and unbreakable. So ask yourself, have you been kind or compliant? Compassionate or consumed, loving or losing yourself in the name of love? The difference lies in awareness, in knowing that boundaries aren't barriers, they are bridges to authentic connection, in realizing that saying no isn't rejection, it's self-respect. Because the moment you stop apologizing for your depth, you stop being a victim of empathy and start being its master. You finally understand that your heart was never meant to be a sponge. It was meant to be a mirror, reflecting truth, not absorbing suffering. And that's the day your real heart begins to beat, steady, sovereign, and free. If this message spoke to your soul, comment, "I see my shadow." Share this video with someone who gives too much, someone who's forgotten their own light. And if you felt this awakening within you, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because here we dive deep into the hidden psychology of the soul, where awareness becomes transformation. Remember, the day you stop bleeding for others is the day you finally learn how to live for yourself.